Thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here in Marseille again. Actually, I was here some 12 years ago, I think. And the paper I would like to present is on duration dependence in unemployment, in finding a job. It's joint work with Raphael Lalive and Josef Zweimüller and Jeremy Suchois, who is a PhD student of Raphael. And actually, much of the credit for this project goes to him because he did most of the hard empirical work for that project. So the question we are addressing in this project is, why does the job finding rate fall with the duration of unemployment? So it's harder for a short-time worker to find, more likely for a short-time unemployed worker to find a new job than it is for a long-term unemployed worker. And I think this is a long-standing question in unemployment research, and this has been addressed by econometricians back in the 1970s, and it's kind of a stylized fact in that literature. Potential explanations are that employers discriminate against unemployed workers, or that, say, the unemployed worker over the duration of unemployment kind of loses attachment to the labor market, and for that reason has increasing difficulties to find a new job. I think it's also fair to say that there's renewed interest in that question. All issues that are related to unemployment have been back on the agenda since the Great Recession, and now with the COVID crisis, of course, we are kind of much more interested in these dynamics, labor market dynamics in particular, also in employment than this was perhaps the case before these shocks. So the research question here is to dig a little deeper into that question than previous research has done, we hope at least, and ask, is the effect of duration on job finding rate driven by the fact that there is duration dependence in search intensity by the job seekers, or is it more related to the employer behavior? That it means that an employer is less willing to give an interview to a job applicant who is long-term unemployed than as opposed to a short-term unemployed worker. Okay? We also are able to not only look at applications and callbacks to job interviews, but we can also look at whether an individual conditional on a job, having had a job interview, is actually offered a job. So I think here we hope to make progress over the existing literature, because we kind of track these various stages in job finding, search intensity, employer reaction, and eventually a job offer by using kind of a data set that has this information in a comprehensive way available. Okay? So we use job seeker information and job applications, callback information on firms, and job offer information by firms. And in particular, the existing literature, there are papers who have looked at search intensity of unemployed workers over the course of unemployment. There are other papers, in particular, there are correspondence studies that have looked whether firms discriminate against the long-term unemployed, but this literature has been studied, looked at these different channels in isolation, and we are making progress by looking at these various stages of the job search, job finding process jointly. And eventually, what we are after is we start out from the job exit profile that falls with duration, and eventually we want to decompose this falling profile into the effect that comes from fewer applications over the course of unemployment, perhaps, or maybe a lower probability to get a callback for the long-term unemployed. And we eventually are after also to say, the initial question, of course, in the first place, is it duration dependence, or is it just a change in composition? Okay? Because if you just look at the falling the job hazard rate, this could the lower job hazard rate with duration could just come from those workers who are still in the unemployment pool at long durations are just workers who have are types who have a low exit probability, and this has nothing to do with duration as such, yeah? But it's just a composition effect. Okay? On the other hand, this is the competing explanation: is duration as such has an impact on the job finding rate, and disentangling the two is of course the crucial thing in general, but also for each dimension we are after. Okay? Fewer job applications could be due to dynamic selection. Only the lazy guys survive, and they send few applications at long durations. Yeah? And it could also be that it has nothing to do with composition. It could be just that you run out of job opportunities and can send fewer applications as you have a long duration of unemployment. Okay? So each dimension needs to be decomposed into the dynamic selection component and the direct effect of duration. Yes?
Can you do anything about dynamic selection on unobservables in your setup? Or?
Yeah, I will talk about this. But eventually what we see in the data, just to have a short answer to that, is that we see at each duration month how many applications an individual sends. And what we can do is we can control for individual fixed effects. And then this is the way kind of to address the issue in terms of applications. It's somewhat more complicated if it comes to callbacks, because as I will discuss later, the fixed effect model doesn't work here. But we have some idea how to address this, and to hear whether you are convinced about how we do that. Okay? So related literature, there is a large literature on search intensity that often uses data from online job boards. Okay? And actually a very closely related paper to ours is the Faberman and Kudliak paper that was published in AHA Macro, and I think that got quite some attention. And they actually find, interestingly, that on the one side that there is negative duration dependence in applications. So it's an individual sends fewer applications with longer durations of the search spell. But interestingly, they find that those who eventually have long durations send more applications at any durations. So this is somehow going against this laziness story. Yeah? And interestingly, we find pretty much the same thing in our context, which is very different actually. Faberman and Kudliak is a US online job board, and we have Switzerland. We have administrative data from Switzerland, which has, I think, in the present context, some advantages because we really know the search duration or the unemployment duration, while in the online job board data, you don't even know whether somebody who searches for a new job is employed or unemployed. And I think here we are somewhat closer to the way our data is structured to what we want to explain, which is unemployment exit rates. Okay? There is other literature to which this is related that tries to dig deeper into understanding or measuring better search intensity of workers along the duration of unemployment spells, to which the paper is somehow related. The other dimension are the employer reaction. Okay? The employer reaction is here if the employer gets an application, the question becomes whether the employer discriminates between short and long-term unemployed. Okay? So whether the callback rate is falling with the duration of unemployment of the particular application. And actually, there was a QJE paper by Croft and co-authors in 2013. In 2013, they did a correspondence test study. They sent similar applications that differ by the duration of previous unemployment by the job seeker, and they find that there is a sharp decrease in the job finding rate with the duration of unemployment. Okay? This is actually not, there are other studies on Sweden, Eriksson and Roth is an AER paper, find in the Swedish context that there is no duration dependence in the callback rate. They're also doing a correspondence testing study, and another paper by Barber and co-authors has more mixed results in US context. One issue is, in this literature, so suppose we take the Croft et al. That finds employers discriminate against the long-term unemployed. The question still is, and this has been addressed in a nice paper by Gregor Jarosz and Laura Pilosov. This is a theoretical paper, whether this is what we see in the correspondence testing study, whether this is kind of true duration dependence, or whether this can be explained by a statistical discrimination story that is where duration dependence doesn't play a role, where what happens is that employer behavior essentially selects the good guys at low durations, and so the bad guys that remain at long durations have are bad types, and for that reason have lower probabilities to get a callback. Okay? So I think we actually are not yet in a position to address this theoretical argument, but what we can back out from our data is actually similar to what Croft and co-authors have done with the correspondence test study. We can figure out whether there is a negative duration dependence. In the empirical data, and what needs to be done is kind of to use this theoretical argument and go one step further to see whether we can say more about statistical discrimination versus true duration dependence. So far, we are not yet there, but this is eventually the plan that we are heading on. Okay, so this is about, this was the introduction, so let me say a few words first about the data and give you some descriptive evidence, and then back out the duration dependence in applications and interviews. And once we have done that, we can say we observe the job hazard, the falling job hazard rate with duration of unemployment. To which extent is this due to job applications, basically the supply side of the problem, and to which extent is this due that, say, with increasing duration, workers get fewer job interviews. Okay? And this decomposition, I think, yields quite some interesting results. And if I have time, I can go a little further, because what the data also what we have in the data is also about how workers apply for jobs. Okay? We do not only see how many applications an unemployed worker sends. We also see whether this is a standard written application, or whether this has been a phone call, or whether this has been a personal contact. Yeah? And perhaps not surprisingly, the personal contacts, yeah, where you probably have some pre-connections to the prospective employer, have a much higher likelihood to get a job interview than just the standard written application. And so to say, the outcome that we see could eventually be due to a change in composition in the application channels. Because initially you send you apply personally if you have the possibility, yeah? And then you run out of these possibilities and increasingly send just standard written applications that have a somewhat lower chance to be invited for an interview. Okay? So that's basically what we can do with the data. So the main innovation of the paper is the new data, and here what we do is this is registered data from the Swiss unemployment insurance, okay? And the way this works is if you're unemployed and want to draw unemployment insurance benefits in Switzerland, you have to regularly go to the public employment office. Actually, it's required that you show up there once a month. And then you need to communicate to the caseworker, and there's one caseworker that is assigned to you initially that typically stays the same, it's the same person that, to whom you talk on a monthly basis. You have to communicate to the caseworker the search activities that you have done over the last month. Okay? And this is, there's actually a mandatory search diary. This is a form which the caseworker, the unemployed worker, has to fill out and show to the caseworker. Okay? And this is kind of an important document. Okay? It has kind of it's almost like a legal document, because you need, on the basis of this form, the caseworker can decide whether you have to be sanctioned because you have not complied with the search activity rules that were the caseworker was requiring from you. Yeah? So I think this is high quality information in this sense, and contains information on, if you take a given application, we see the month when it was sent. Yeah? So we can assign, say this was sent in month 3 of your unemployment spell. Yeah? This would be a short-term unemployed worker that was sent, or alternatively, this could be month 15 in your unemployment spell. Okay? Then we see, and this is recorded, and so the caseworker and the unemployed worker, when they come together next month, they would fill out previous month search diary and record whether there was a callback or not. We also see whether there was eventually a job offer or not. Yeah? And the search diary also records the search channel, whether it was written, phone, or in person.
Can you refuse job offers and still get the benefits, or do you?
This is, you can, of course, refuse a job offer. Whether this has an impact on whether you are sanctioned or not depends on the particular case, and this is on the discretion of the caseworker.
I wonder about the incentives of people to tell the truth about their job searching activities.
Actually, on the job offer, it's typically if a job offer is made by the firm, okay, in the majority of cases, the job offer is accepted. Okay. So we could not do a fixed effect analysis for that reason, because you only see one job offer at the end of the spell, and that's it.
Yeah, but perhaps this happens because people do not report when they didn't accept the job offer.
Yeah, this could in principle be the case, but actually the idea of the Public Employment Administration is not only to help the job seeker to find a job, but also to help firms to fill their vacancies. And there will be, there will be checks by the caseworker whether the worker actually showed up to the job interview and what the outcome of the interview from the firm side would have been. Yeah? And for that reason, I think the risk for the unemployed workers to not tell the truth, yeah, is relatively high, because if you do something like this, they could cut your benefit actually to 0 for a certain period of time. Yeah? for that reason, I don't think it's super. This is not the big problem of the data. A bigger problem of the data is actually censoring. That we, as I will explain in a minute, we observe the unemployment inflow and over a certain period of time, and then we have applications that were sent shortly before our observation period ends, and then we don't know eventually what happened to that application. Did it result in a callback? Was a job of eventually made? So this is a main problem actually in the data censoring.
Can you see details on the employer side? So company size, for example, because the screening process may be different for bigger companies. So maybe unemployment duration is important, for bigger companies only, which have a stricter screening process than the smaller ones.
This is true. Yeah. So this is one drawback of the data set we know a lot about. So what we can do is actually we can track the application. But we unfortunately don't know anything about the identity of the firm to which the worker applied. Yeah. Of course, this would be great because then we could see in our data, which covers the universe of unemployed workers, at least in certain regions, which unemployed worker has applied to which job. And maybe there are more unemployed workers applying to the same job. Yeah. But this is information we unfortunately don't have. Yeah. It actually would be recorded in the data. But back then, we digitized this a long time ago, actually. And back then, we were not able to digitize the firm information. And this is not part of the analysis for this reason, we do here.
Do you know whether the applications were fulfilled by somebody at the end in the process? For each single application, do you know whether somebody else got it when the person did not?
For exactly the reason I explained before, we don't know. Okay. Because we don't know the identity of the firm who posted the vacancy, we cannot track this. Yeah.
Application to posts, or does it also include spontaneous applications just to a firm or like any job?
The difference between a firm post and open vacancy, and you apply directly just for this post, or what is called like a spontaneous application to like a local company, basically saying like, this is my profile. If you have a job open, I'd be interested for it.
It includes spontaneous applications in this sense, and I would say the personal application is such a spontaneous application. Yeah. The majority of the personal will be such. Yeah. We have the distinction between the personal and the written, but not whether this was officially posted or not. Okay, so the mandatory search diary contains the Social Security number of the unemployed worker, and we can link that to the unemployment register. So this is, of course, important in the present context because register data contain all socioeconomic characteristics of the unemployed worker, and we also connect it to the Social Security data that has all the information on previous earnings and work history, and also on the future earnings and work history. Okay, so eventually, if we see that a job offer has been made, then we can check in the Social Security data whether there was indeed labor income generated thereafter. Okay, and we check that, and actually this tells us that job offer information here is actually informative for future earnings. So this is the search diary. Okay, it contains actually in French. It contains the name, it contains the Social Security number, and the month when the search diary was filled out. And then for all the applications that were sent in that particular month, yeah, we know it's actually here the address of the enterprise. This is handwritten, and for that reason we didn't digitize. We couldn't back then digitize it and do not use it. It's also the quality of this information is not that high. It's much better what's over here. It basically here it tells us vacancy number 1 or job application number 1 has reached a particular stage. Is still pending. Yeah, I got a reaction and was not invited to a job interview, or I got a reaction and was invited to a job interview. And when I was invited to a job interview, did I get a job offer or not? This is the information that we can use here. What we also can do, is we actually looked at the sequence of the application. Okay? Because you might think the first applications I make is an application that has a higher chance of being invited, to invitation, yeah? Which actually we find is the case. So the first and the second have a somewhat higher chance to be called back, and the later applications have just a constant probability that does systematically with the number within the month. The data source is all individuals who are registered as job seekers in public employment offices in one of 5 Swiss cantons. So Canton Zurich is a large canton. Canton Bern is another large canton. Vaud in the French part of Switzerland is also included, and also St. Gallen and Zug, which are 2 smaller cantons that could be covered here. These were the regional employment offices are organized on a cantonal level, and these 5 cantons were willing to share this data, basically. So this is random in this sense. So overall, we have close to 15,000 job seekers who lost their job or were actually in the stock of unemployment between April 2012 and March 2013. So this is a stock flow sample, because we take the entire stock who was unemployed in March 2012 and the entire inflow between April 2012 and March 2013. Okay? And these job seekers sent in total more than 600,000 job applications that resulted in 22,000 interviews, and eventually 4,300 got a job offer. Okay? And this we need, in order to study the duration of unemployment, we need this to aggregate on a duration month to the duration month level. Yeah? So we have 59,000 spell month observations. Okay? It's also important to be precise on what we exactly measure. The month tau here, the duration month tau, is the month when the application was sent. Yeah? It's not necessarily the month when the interview took place, or when the job offer was made, or when the individual actually got a job. Yeah? It's the tau always refers to the application, to the duration month when the application was sent. So this is the structure of the data, and here we emphasize the fact that I mentioned before, that censoring is an issue here. Yeah? So we have many applications. For the non-censored applications where we know the outcome, we can say this resulted in an interview or not. Yeah? For the interview, we have some interviews where we don't know from the form what eventually the outcome was, whether the worker was offered a job or not. But for some we do, and then we can exploit the job offer information. And because of these censoring issues, we have a situation where we have, so to say, from these 15,000 workers that are in our sample, we have only 4,000 who eventually got a job offer. And this, the problem is censoring. Okay. Here's some descriptive statistics. So information here is at the monthly level, and the number of applications sent by the typical job seeker is 10. Yeah? But you had a question.
You cannot distinguish when people switch fields. I suppose this would play a large role. If I'm changing careers, it may take a while for me to find a job. So, yeah, you don't have the firm ID, but do you have the industry I'm applying to compare it with where I was employed before?
We don't. This is actually information that would be in the form, yeah, but it's handwritten and we didn't digitize it. Yeah. It's low quality information, I would say. Even if we would have digitized it, we probably would have not complete information about that. But in principle, this information is collected. Yeah. And if I would start that project today, I would really try hard to digitize this information. But we couldn't do it back then. And then we could actually study what you are suggesting. Yeah, I think it would be super interesting to see whether if I'm heading for a different occupation, because it will take longer for me to find, or the duration of the search spell will be longer, which could be related to the fact that I do some training program in between, yeah, and things like that. Yeah. All this information is in principle available at the Public Employment Office. Yeah.
Is there a certain number of applications that people are kind of pushed to send on a monthly basis?
Yes.
Like okay.
That's actually the case. So if you just draw the distribution of the number of applications, you see a spike at 8 and 10. Yeah? Okay. Some public employment offices require 8 applications for the typical job seeker. Some require 10 applications per month. Yeah? But there's actually quite some variation here, as you see. The standard deviation is quite substantial, and this is what this is the information what we use. We actually did the entire analysis on the number of job applications as deviations from the standard, yeah, which basically led to pretty much the same conclusions with respect to the duration profile as the overall application number. Okay, so the typical unemployed job seeker sends 10 applications per month and gets a job interview every other month. Okay, so many applications just do not result in a job interview. So the callback rate in the data, the raw callback rate in the data, is 4.8%. It's actually very, very similar to the callback rate that Croft and co-authors found for the US. Yeah. In the Swedish case, the Ericsson Road paper that I mentioned before, they find a somewhat higher callback rate, close to 10%, but still, saying that a lot of applications that you send just don't result in an interview. Yeah. So in this sense, I think we are basically, we do not find very different things from data similar to other data sets. So one piece of information that is actually really new, and I'm not aware of any study that would have this information, is whether a job offer was made. Yeah? And actually, if you compare these two numbers, interviews and job offers, so you can say 1 in 4 interviews results on average in a job offer. Okay? This is actually, I will not say much about job offers in this talk, but this is also some way where we want to dig deeper, because here we have something new, I think, to say, and we want to better explain also the duration profile in the job offers. Another piece of information in the data that is interesting is whether the application was a personal application, a phone call, or a written application, or some combination. Not surprisingly, perhaps, most applications are written, but also the personal applications are kind of relevant in the Swiss context. At least 1 in 8 application is actually a personal application. And these applications are actually concentrated early on in the unemployment spell and are more successful than the other applications. Okay, so these are the data. Let me now give you some descriptive evidence. Okay? And the first piece of evidence that we are interested in is actually the job offer rate. Okay? So what is the probability that an application sent in the month 1 of the unemployment spell eventually results in a job offer? Okay? This is relatively high early on. Okay? So this is actually the probability that I get at least 1 job offer, to be precise. Okay? And then it's falling with duration. Okay? This is actually not the piece of evidence that on which where the stylized fact arises. Okay? This is the red. This is the probability that I get from a typical unemployment insurance register data, yeah, where I can say what is the probability that I get that I leave unemployment in month 4 and start a new job. Okay. So here, what this graph shows us is essentially, eventually we are interested in that red graph, yeah? But what we observe in our data is the blue. Okay? And the blue tells us an application sent in that month, what is the probability that a job offer is made. And this actually, if we would shift this blue line 2 months to the right, yeah, then you pretty much would see it coincides pretty much with the exit rate from unemployment. So this tells us that actually the job offer information that we have in the search diary, yeah, is actually informative about the duration profile of the unemployment exit rate, which we are eventually interested. Yeah? Okay. And we did some more descriptive analysis to make this precise. And indeed, on average, for applications that eventually get a job offer, yeah, it lasts on average 2 months, yeah, to see in the Social Security data an increase in earnings. So I think this is corresponding to what we see here.
The longer duration there. You've got your hello. You've got your observation window is about 11 months. So all the high durations, these are coming from the initial stock of the unemployed?
Yes. Okay. Yes.
And the unemployed, they are not first-time searchers because they have to. We're talking about re-employment probabilities. So in order to be in your system, they need to be unemployed.
This could be that this is their first unemployment spell. It could also be a repeat spell.
No, but what I mean is they're not first entrants in the job market. They have been employed before in order to get
yes.
into your system.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So all these workers that are included in the data are eligible for unemployment benefits. And in order to be eligible to unemployment, he had to have an employment spell from at least, depending on age, a year or more. Yeah. Okay, so job applications. So this is what we just see in the raw data. If you take applications that were sent early on relative to applications that were sent later on, then the number of applications sent by workers in their in the early phase of the unemployment spell is relatively high, and later in the spell is somewhat lower. Okay? You would have maybe expected that this falls very, very strongly, because you are long-term unemployed, you just don't do anything anymore, but this is actually not the case. It's even the long-term unemployed who are sending many applications and are not very far off the average number, which is somewhat more than 10 applications per month. The other piece of evidence is...
How many rows are there in the form, the application, in the diary?
How many?
How many rows? Is it about 10 or 11 rows in which people can fill in information?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 on a sheet. Yeah, and then you would just start another sheet that looks exactly like that. Yeah. But it's always clear which month it is because it's written over here. I think that's not a particular issue in the digitization or something. Yeah. Sorry. Okay, this is job applications. This is callbacks to job interviews. Okay? And here we see that the probability that a job application results in a callback is relatively high early on and is substantially smaller later on. Okay? Actually, if you in relation, if you compare these data points to this data point, they are almost 50% lower than for the short-term unemployed. Taking applications and callbacks together, yeah, we see the number of job interviews. Yeah? And the number of job interviews is sharply falling with duration because, on the one side, job seekers send somewhat fewer applications with duration. On the other side, the probability that a given application results in a job interview is falling with duration, and in sum, this results in a strongly falling duration profile. Now, the final piece of evidence that we can back out from this search diary is the job offer probability. Okay? So conditional on having a job interview, what is the probability that you are offered a job? Okay? And interestingly, this probability is flat. Okay? So this basically means that if an employer decides to call back a long-term unemployed worker for a job interview, then the guy is considered as a reasonable candidate. Yeah? And this shows up here that the probability actually this probability doesn't change with unemployment duration. Okay? And this is actually duration profile is actually would be consistent with the theoretical analysis of Jarosz and Pilosov that I mentioned before, that tried to make sense of the correspondence testing studies for the falling callback rates. Yeah? That says that essentially the outcome of the Jarosz-Pilosov analysis is to say that what we see, the falling callback rate, is not necessarily a true duration dependence. It's just statistical discrimination of types that are unchanged with unemployment duration, that eventually this statistical discrimination behavior by employers lead to the callback duration profile that is found in this empirical data, including the Croft et al., but also the duration profile that we see in our data. Okay. Now, as I mentioned before, this is an open question of our project. We really need to do more to better understand this. Yeah? And also because this is information that other studies don't have. Okay, let me just summarize. So what we see is that the monthly job offer rate decreases, okay, and long-term unemployed workers have up to 40% fewer job offers than short-term unemployed workers. Okay. So this is the first graph, the very first graph that I showed you that closely corresponds to the job exit rate that we see from unemployment register data. And we see this is partly due to fewer applications. So long-term unemployed have some 10% fewer applications, but a sharp decrease in the empirical callback rate, 40% lower callback rate for the long-term unemployed, and a job offer probability conditional on an interview that remains unchanged with duration. Okay. Okay, thanks. Yes.
I'm wondering, so as far as I can see, all the stats you just showed are consistent with the idea that people give lower quality applications over time, partly because they're pushed into making 10 applications, for example, and they make 10 applications, but maybe the last 8 are not so useful for them. Do you have any evidence of this, or are you going to come back to this at all?
We are working on this. Yeah. I don't have it on my slides. But to some extent, this is the short answer to that question that I cannot show you graphs today. But to some extent, the duration profile is due to a change in the composition of the applications. I sent more personal, or there are more personal applications early on in the spell, and there are few, and there are increasingly the application composition consists of written applications at later stages, and because the personal have a higher chance to be called back, this will partly explain the duration. This composition will partly explain the duration profile. Okay, so this was just descriptive. Now I come to the interesting issue, because we see falling, say, job applications. Is it because individuals send fewer applications when they are long-term unemployed, or is it because the guys who are still in unemployment at month 12 are just individuals who send few applications? Yeah? So that disentangling the duration dependence from unobserved heterogeneity from this dynamic selection mechanism is, of course, the crucial thing here. Now, in terms of applications, what I can do is I can just use the information that for one individual job searcher, I know how many applications he or she sends in months 1, 2, and so on. So I can just apply a fixed effect model, and back out duration dependence and unobserved heterogeneity. This could, you might think in principle we could do the same thing for the callbacks as well, because we see for one individual more callbacks, hopefully over the unemployment spell. But the problem here is that we cannot, the fixed effects model doesn't work, essentially because the callbacks are kind of at the end of the unemployment spell. Yeah? Because typically when I get a callback, the chances that I eventually get a job offer are higher. Yeah? So the fixed effect model will just not work because the outcome is concentrated, the positive outcome is concentrated at the end of the unemployment spell. Okay? So due to this systematic patterns in the data, I cannot apply the fixed effect model, and we have some other idea how we can, or implemented another idea to address the dynamic selection restoration dependence issue. Okay. Now, in terms of job applications, I can run the fixed effect model. So I get a duration month fixed effect to the individual fixed effect, and then I have so here actually these are individual characteristics that should have a tau here that are time varying. Yeah? Okay, for instance, a time varying characteristic would be the quarter of whether this is winter time or summer. Yeah, this would be a time varying covariate, and because of the high seasonality in unemployment, this is relevant to control for that. Okay.
Could you explain why you don't use the duration model? That's a linear regression, yeah?
Because it's more simple. Actually, the outcome is a number of, it's not an event. Yeah? I would apply a duration model for, say, probability that I get a job in month T or something. Yeah? Here I observe the certain number of applications month by month.
You could rephrase it in the form of, say, a mixed proportional hazard model where you have got your random effect, dynamic selection, all that going through that stuff. And,
perhaps, yeah. Yeah, so far we didn't do that. Maybe we should think about it. But yeah. Okay, so then for individuals, we observe what is the what is the average number of applications sent in the first month, and then we can use this to study or to calculate what would be the number of applications if we disregard this component, this duration component. And then we can also say, if we take the same set of individuals, what would be the number of applications they sent? That would be just that we get rid of that we hold composition constant and draw the duration profile, given the estimated duration fixed effects. Okay? Now, if you do that, duration-dependent job applications, here in blue we have what the empirical duration profile, and then we say let's keep composition constant and only use the estimated duration fixed effects. We see that actually there's negative duration dependence in the number of applications. Indeed, so that early on you send many applications, later on you send fewer applications, and this effect is actually sizable. Yeah? So if you just looked at the empirical profile, we would say there's one application less later at long durations than it was initially, but if you keep the composition constant, this is much more than that. It's actually more than 3 applications per month less. Okay? The different way to look at the same thing is to say that what does this imply for dynamic selection? Okay? This actually must mean that those individuals who eventually stay very long in unemployment are those individuals who send many applications. Okay? This is actually against this naive view that you are long-term unemployed because your search intensity, because you are a low search intensity guy. Okay? Now this is, as you see here, this is sizable. Yeah? So. And highly significant, and actually is a pattern in our data that is very similar to what other studies have found in other data sets, in other contexts. For instance, the Faberman and Kudliak paper on online job board in the US actually find very similar patterns in the data with respect to job applications.
I was wondering whether you looked at this, so the number of applications, is it very dependent on the field, like if you, on the type of job, to think a bit more about that selection? Like if you are in the primary sector, secondary sector, in the service sector, or is everybody roughly?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of heterogeneity, as I showed also in the descriptives before. So not everybody sends 10 applications. There's actually quite some standard deviation around the mean. And it's certainly the case that if you work in a very specific field where not very many jobs are around, the caseworker will not say you have to send 10 applications, because this is kind of agreed on a bilateral basis depending on the particular job market in which the unemployed workers.
But to get a feel of whether you interpret it as there are some individual characteristics of people who send a lot of applications that are correlated with a longer employment duration, or there are some jobs where you have long search and also you send more applications.
Yes, we did that because what we do in the empirical analysis is actually controlling for would be time varying fixed effect. This is not true, but this is in the data. So we have the age of the individual, with occupation of the individual. We know whether the individual earned a lot of a high wage or a low wage previously, and this all would be my suspicion would be relevant to explain this. And in the empirical analysis, of course, this is picked up. This is picked up in the individual fixed effect. So we estimate a variation in these individual fixed effects, of course, and this reflects actually what your intuition is, that some individuals work in segments where there are many jobs around and will, for this reason, send many applications. Other individuals work in labor market segments where only few jobs are around and you will send few.
A related comment. Here you're imposing that the duration dependence part is the same for everyone. So right, the fixed effect just switches the levels. Yes. Could you get at different effects? So, for instance, interacting the duration dependence.
This is in principle possible. This is what we have not yet done so far, but this is actually
right. You could interact it with observables at least to see.
Yes. Yeah.
Or
even the unemployment register gives us this information: education, occupation, age, and so on. Yes, absolutely. Okay. Oops. Okay, so the result from job application that we get is that there is substantial duration dependence in the data. So the long-term unemployed send fewer applications, okay? But the composition is such that the long-term long-term unemployed individuals are those types who send many applications at all durations. Okay? And as I mentioned before, this is similar evidence that others have found before. Now let me come to the callback, to the employer reaction to applications sent by job seekers. As I mentioned before, the fixed effect model here doesn't work because callbacks are concentrated at the end of the spell, and for this reason we would overestimate the effect of duration. Now, for this reason, we need to come up with something, with a different strategy, and the one that we propose here is to say that we can predict the ex-ante chances of a particular individual to be invited to a job interview based on the success of the application that is sent by this individual in the first month of the spell. Yeah? And this, if we do this analysis only on these early on these applications sent early, we can construct an index that for an individual with certain characteristics that we can put into a regression, okay, and say and see how callback probabilities later on are changing relative to callback probabilities for the same individual early on. Okay? Now, this is, of course, basically we start out from a cross-sectional regression, but I think the way to justify that is that in our data, we have pretty much the information that the employer sees on the CV. We see we see as researchers in the data education, age, the previous work history of the worker, the occupation, and so on. Yeah? And this is basically the same information that the recruiter uses when deciding whether he or she should invite the job seeker to an interview or not. Okay? And to the extent this is true, we think that the procedure we implement here is actually a reasonable procedure. Okay? So just to be precise what we are doing, so C is an indicator whether individual I's application A that was sent in month 1 results in a callback or not. And we regress this on individual characteristics. Okay? And then we can construct from these first early on applications what is the ex ante chance for an application sent in months tau. Okay? So here what we do is the x may have changed between 1 and tau, yeah? But we use the estimated deltas here to calculate this ex ante chance. Yeah? And then we do callbacks for all applications, not only early on but also later applications, and regress this on this ex ante index. Okay? And the idea here is that the gamma would capture dynamic selection, while the phi here would give us the duration dependence. Okay? That's the logic we apply here. Again, this is just how we can then calculate from these estimates how the duration profile would look like if there was no duration dependence, everything were dynamic selection, or vice versa. When there are no changes in composition, we can use our estimated duration fixed effects to estimate the duration dependence. Okay? Now what we see here is the blue is the empirically observed duration profile of the callback rate. Okay? This would become flatter if I keep composition constant. Okay? So part of it is indeed that the long-term unemployed have bad chances to get a callback. Okay? So getting rid of that composition would make the duration profile of the callback rates flatter, but there would still be a negative profile.
Do you remove the personal applications? Because the argument of the selection on observables, it works really well if you send a CV to someone you don't know, but if you apply to someone you know, then the unobservable problem is more important. So if you look at both, it might tell you whether the strategy is. If it's the same, whether you remove them, then it means that the strategy is very.
Yeah, this is a well-taken comment. This is not taken into account here. Yeah. This is important to keep in mind also for all the further results that I show you, is that these compositional changes in the type of application are not yet, I should say, taken into account. Okay. Now, of course, the flip side is duration dependence. Okay. So this is there's negative duration dependence in the callback rate, and this is sizable. Okay. So you can say 50-50 is negative duration dependence, and dynamic selection if it comes to the callback rate. Okay. Again, we find here that the long-term unemployed have fewer callbacks at all durations. This effect is qualitatively important and also consistent with previous literature. Okay. Now, finally, we can do the decomposition. Okay. So we started out from that graph. This is the job offer rate. What's the probability that I get at least one job offer from applications sent in months tau? Okay. This is this negative profile that we can use. And I showed you also before that if you shift this 2 months to the right, then this almost perfectly coincides with the unemployment exit rate that we see from the unemployment resistant data. Yeah? And this is, for this reason, we focus on, or we think that focusing on the job offer rate as observed in the job diary is indeed informative on negative duration dependence. Okay? Now, what we essentially do here can do the composition is that we can say, okay, this is the probability that I get at least one job offer from applications sent in month tau, depends, of course, on how many interviews this job offer generates. Yeah? And the decomposition idea is basically saying that I can decompose the interviews into the callback rate and the applications. And what the composition exercise essentially does is saying what would be the callback profile, would the duration have stayed constant, but only the entire duration effect comes from applications, or vice versa, yeah, to say its duration dependence in the callback rate or its duration dependence in the application. That makes a difference, and this gives me for the particular exercise the counterfactual interviews per month. And if I know the counterfactual interview per month, I can calculate. I can back out the job offer rate. That's basically the idea. And here we do the math, how to calculate what are predicted interviews without duration dependence in applications, callbacks, and what is, if we get rid of all duration dependence, yeah, how would the job offer profile look like? Okay. Now this is actually the duration profile of interviews. It's not yet job offers, it's interviews. So early on, the probability that I get at least, it's actually the number of applications that I get out of, number of interviews that I get out of applications in month 1 is 0.5 early on, and falls over time. Okay. I can ask to which extent is this falling blue profile due to the fact that individuals send fewer applications over time. Okay. If I get rid of this duration dependence in application, actually this profile, the number of interviews shift up. Okay. I can do the same thing with callbacks. Okay. So if I hold duration, if I take applications as they are, yeah, but only remove duration dependence in callbacks, there would be more interviews. Okay, so the statement is that duration dependence in the callback rate are to a substantial extent the reason why the number of interviews are falling over time. Now, if I take out duration dependence in job applications and duration dependence in callbacks, it's actually what we find is that number of interviews are flat. Okay? And now, I mentioned that the information that we have on top to applications and job callbacks is the information on conditional on an interview. What is the probability that I get that eventually I get a job offer? Okay? And this probability is flat, and this is actually, oops, sorry. Let's jump ahead. And it seems that there is no duration dependence in the probability that an employer makes a job offer to an interviewed applicant. It seems that the decision if the employer decides to interview a long-term unemployed worker, then somehow it doesn't seem to be relevant for the job offer decision whether there is no systematic difference in the probability that long-term unemployed workers get job offers.
Joseph, you have only 2 or 3 minutes left.
Okay. Now, when I can, so far what I have said is how do the number of interviews change? Okay, and I'm sorry. But eventually we are interested in the probability of getting a job offer. Now, I showed you how we set up the analysis, how interviews translate into job offers. Okay, if we take this predictions, then we can do the same thing as we did for job interviews. We can calculate what is the job offer probability, and in the hypothetical situation when there is no duration dependence in job applications. I'm sorry. We can also calculate the hypothetical job offer rate when there is no duration dependence in callbacks. Okay? And we can do the same thing when we can calculate the hypothetical job offer rate under in the counterfactual situation when there is no duration dependence in the applications and no duration dependence in callbacks. And interestingly, then the job offer rate would actually be flat. Okay? So it's essentially to say that duration dependence explains the entire falling job offer rate. Okay? Now I've run out of time. Just summarize. So we use this search diary data that has comprehensive information on job applications, interviews, and job offers in the UI register of Switzerland, and we use the repeated observations in job applications to isolate duration dependence using the fixed effect model. For callbacks, we cannot do that for the reason I mentioned, and we propose another procedure, and we think this is relevant and reasonable to the extent that what we see in our data is kind of the same thing on which recruiters base their interview decisions. Okay? And the result is that the falling job offer rate is driven by duration dependence. Actually, if you do the calculation, we find we can also quantify the importance of falling applications relative to falling callback rates. And this calculation says that the falling callback rate is more important than falling application. Okay. Now, this is to say that this is quantitatively important and that duration dependence can fully account for the falling job offer rate. Finally, does it mean does this mean dynamic selection is completely unimportant? It is actually not the case, because what we find is that there is positive duration dependence, there is positive dynamic selection, in terms of job applications, because those guys who eventually stay long-term unemployed are searching harder at all durations. Yeah? And there is a negative selection in terms of callback rates, because the types that have low chances to get invited are increasing share in the unemployment pool. But these two types of composition actually neutralize each other. Okay? And in total, we see that the hypothetical job offer profile, okay, hypothetically in the absence of a duration dependence, would be completely flat. Okay, so I mentioned the caveats and the open questions that many of you have spotted along the way anyway that we need to do, and that's work to be done.
We unfortunately have
thank
time
you very
for
much.
question, but Josef Zweimüller will be with us this afternoon, so feel free to step by his office.